So where we kind of ended last class was this concept of what's happening between the calcaneus and the talus. So what I wanted to first cover was what the subtalar joint was. Like we said last class, subtalar neutral is a thing you're going to hear in the clinic a lot, especially when it comes to measuring for orthotics. And the subtalar joint literally says what it is and is what it says, right? We all know what the word sub means by now. It just means under. So it's just the joint under the talus. The subtalar joint mostly refers to the articulation between the talus and the calcaneus. Now, what you can see from the pictures is that not only does the talus have an articulation between the talus and calcaneus, but there's also another articulation up here between the talus and the navicular. So understand that. Now, where that's going to become very important is as we start getting into the ligaments, remember how most of the ligaments are named, right? They're named between the two bones they attach. So that's going to become very important because as we're going to see, these ligament names for the foot, I'm going to be honest with you, you're going to win some points in Scrabble because there's a lot of letters, right? These are big old words. But every word is going to say exactly what it attaches, right? We're going to hit words like calcaneal navicular ligament, right? Or the calcaneocuboid ligament. Big word, but you should be able to break that down by now and say, well, that just attaches my calcaneus to my cuboid. Not a big deal, okay? So with the subtalar joint, we're going to have some very complex motions that happen at the subtalar joint. One of those motions is going to be supination. And I can't spell already. Now, what we have to understand with supination is that supination is going to be a complex combination motion. Okay, so please do not think that inversion equals supination or eversion equals pronation. Okay, inversion is part of supination. Eversion is part of pronation. But there's other things that are happening as well. And the reason that they're happening as well, why we have these complex combination motions, is that the talus does articulate at, if you read in Gray's, at 3 different articulating processes or 3 different facets. But if you look at a top-down picture, if you remove the talus and look at those facets, they're all angled just a little bit differently. So this is no different than when we covered the low back and we covered facet joints or the zygapophyseal joints in the low back, right? Remember this thing, arms here for cervical, arms here for thoracic, arms here for lumbar. Same concept. The problem is that if you're going to put your arms up, it's going to be like this, okay? You see the problem? Now, if I have my arms like this, and I have one arm sticking straight up in the air and one arm out to the side, but it's a little bit of an angle, and I try to move forward, what's going to happen? It's going to rotate and abduct and plantar flex, right? Or if I go the other direction, it's going to dorsiflex and evert and abduct, right? I'm going to have all these different combination motions. So that's exactly what we see with pronation and supination, is that it is a combination motion, not necessarily because we're trying to perform that one singular motion, but it just kind of happens due to the morphology of the subtalar joint. And that's why I have those pictures in the middle here. As I said last class, there's a little bit of an angle. It's about 42 degrees where the talus articulates with the calcaneus. There's another angle about 5 to 8 degrees in the transverse plane. So that talus is just a little bit off. It's not a 90-90 perpendicular straight line concept, okay? If you don't understand that, then supination pronation turns into a very difficult concept. Be very honest and candid with you. So here's what we see with supination. Okay, supination is going to be a combination of three different things. It's going to be a combination of plantar flexion, inversion, and adduction of the calcaneus, or, I'm going to put a little star down here, and we'll get into this a little more, talar abduction. Because remember what we said last class about the talus, right? My talus is just going along for the ride. So if my calcaneus adducts, my talus will abduct. If my calcaneus abducts, then my talus will adduct. Thank you for the 3 people that answered. So that's what we have to think about. Okay, so supination is one of these combination motions. Now, why is that important? Because if we are going to prescribe a shoe for a person, right? Okay, so that's one thing we've probably seen PTs do. I do it all the time for my patients. Hey, you have this type of foot. Your foot hits the ground in this manner. I think you need this type of shoe. If somebody supinates when they run or when they walk, would we think that that person has a very rigid foot or a very flexible foot? Very rigid foot, right? So one thing we can correlate a lot of times is supination is going to have a rigid foot. Would you say that supination is going to have a very high arch or a very low arch? Who's going for high? Who's going for low? Going for high. Everybody going for low? Okay, it's high arch. Okay, so usually we see an increase in the medial longitudinal arch. Because remember, there's 3 arches. If we see a really super duper high arch, we are going to call that a very special term. And literally what we're going to call it is we're going to call it based on the Latin of what it looks. So if I have a super high arch like that, and I have all this space in the middle, it kind of looks like a cave. So what's the word for foot? Pes, right? If I'm pedaling, I'm using my foot, which is why I always find it a little funny when I'm in the clinic and somebody gets on an arm bike and someone says, okay, go ahead and pedal the arm bike. And I'm like, no, they're going to handle the arm bike. So I might see pes cavus. And this is why it's important because, and I got this question in functional lab on Monday, well, what type of shoe do you tell your patients to get? And what was my answer to that? No, it depends. What's that? Whatever works best for them. Exactly. And I tell my patients that all the time. You cannot buy your shoe based on the logo on the side, right? I don't care if you got the swoosh. I don't care if you got the Saucony thing, whatever, okay? You need to buy the shoe that's best for you because each of those brands has a spectrum of shoes, right? So I'll give you an example, okay? New Balances, and I know New Balances are typically, correlated with dad shoes. Don't worry, I have a pair. You've seen them. But what does the 3-digit code on each New Balance refer to? Yeah, 574. Mine are 665s, I think, something like that. What is that 3-digit code? Arch or stability in the shoe. Okay. A lot of people don't know that because a lot of people, what they're told is go buy some New Balances. So if I have a very rigid foot, if I have pescatus, if I am supinating or over supinating, am I able to produce a lot of force or am I able to disperse a lot of force? Produce a lot of force because of a very rigid foot. And if I can produce a lot of force, what am I then not able to do? Disperse a lot of force. So then if I am telling that patient you need to go buy a certain type of shoe, do I want them to buy a shoe that will allow them to have more stability or more cushioning, therefore less stability? Probably less stability, right? Because if I'm already super duper rigid, already supinated, I don't want to have that patient stand in or run in a very rigid shoe, because literally what have I done? I've put one rigid object on top of another rigid object. What does that create? A super duper rigid object, okay? So what I typically do is, okay, patient, you are over supinating when you stand, when you walk, when you run, what have you. I'm going to print out a list of shoes that are going to be shock absorbing shoes. Pick out your shoe from that list. Instead of giving them, you need to go buy the New Balance 332s or something. Okay? But you have to understand how this works. The other thing that we're going to see with supination is that my tibia, and you can actually do this one on yourself, my tibia is going to externally rotate. Now, that's a fun concept. Because now, hopefully, what you're starting to think about is, oh man, that may have some ramifications at the knee. Uh-oh, right? Because when my knee enters the screw home mechanism, does it externally rotate or does it internally rotate? When it locks into extension. External, right? Okay, so now I have a supinated foot. I'm already externally rotated at my tibia. What's that going to do to my knee? It doesn't allow it to unlock nearly as well now, okay? So you're kind of seeing now how what happens at my foot and my ankle is now going to have a ramification at my knee. So here's what the patient comes in with. They don't come in with foot and ankle pain. They come in with medial knee pain. Think about how that would happen, okay? So now my patient's coming in with medial knee pain. Or they come in with something even worse. They come in with a medial meniscus tear. They sheared off their medial meniscus. Why did they shear off their medial meniscus? Compensated by one, they actually back it up one big step. Say it loud.
Uneven joint loading.
Uneven joint loading. Okay, why uneven joint loading? Because they supinate, which then does not allow them to unlock their knee when they need to unlock their knee nearly as much or nearly as well, which then creates shear force along the medial meniscus. Now here's the problem, okay? That person's going to go in, they're going to get an arthroscopic meniscectomy, okay? Knee scope. Going for a knee scope. Okay, and I've seen this happen so many times. I'll never forget, I had a police officer when I worked up in Columbus, Ohio. This like exactly the case. Go in, fix a meniscus. 4 visits later, guess what that patient starts complaining of? The same knee pain that he originally went to the doc for. Okay? Now, he had a torn meniscus. That needed to be fixed. Okay, the surgeon did a great job, and the guy's better. They did not address the underlying issue because that's my job, right? That's your job. I need to figure out why that person tore their medial meniscus in the first place. Okay, and you have to understand how these mechanics work, or it's just going to turn into a treatment session like, well, get on the bike, let's throw a cold pack on it, some diathermy and whatever. And, you know, and I don't mean to knock diathermy, but, you know, it's, sorry, when I was in school, I was like, really, diathermy? But you catch my point, okay? So we have to address the mechanics. We have to understand the intricate nature between each of these joints and between each of these body parts if we're really going to truly understand how the human body works. So supination, like I said, plantar flexion, inversion, adduction of the calcaneus. What we're going to see is that the adduction of the calcaneus is most likely going to happen when we're non-weight bearing. When we're weight bearing, it can happen, but it's going to be a lot easier to do it when it's non-weight bearing. Now, during weight bearing, and we have a couple slides after this, we'll go over it again. Weight bearing, that's when we're going to see a lot of that action-reaction relationship between the talus and calcaneus. Because what we have to think about is how the force of the ground, or the normal force, shoots up through the calcaneus, and then how the talus is going to react to that force as well. Okay, so there's supination. Any questions on supination? Yes?
You said that because the tibia is externally rotated, supination, that's what makes it harder to unlock the screw mechanism.
There's going to be a mechanical disadvantage to unlock during the screw mechanism, because the screw mechanism is external rotation, right? So I'm going to be already preset in external rotation, which means it's going to be harder for me to internally rotate. Make sense? Okay. No worries, no worries. This is not, like I said, this is the roughest part of the class outside of the viscera. That wasn't fun. All right, next one. All right, pronation. What we're going to see with pronation is we're going to see eversion. We're going to see dorsiflexion. And we're going to see abduction. And like I said, that talus likes to do some funny, weird things. So we can see talar adduction. Abduction of calcaneus. So the nice thing about supination and pronation is if you learn one of them, all you got to do is flip and everything else falls into place. Okay, so we'll kind of go through that process. So if I have pronation, would I expect to see a high arch or a low arch? Low arch. So low medial longitudinal arch. So when we have a fallen or low medial longitudinal arch, it's going to have another word. It's going to start with pes. Pes planus or pes planus. And the way I always think of this is that this person plants their arch. The layman's term, the eponym for this is going to be a flat-footed person. So with a flat-footed person, somebody that has pes planus, would we expect to see a more rigid foot or a more flexible foot? A more flexible foot, right. So this is going to lead to a flexible foot. The other thing we're going to see is that now I'm going to have tibia or tibial internal rotation. Ooh. Exactly. So I'm going to have implications for the screw home mechanism as well at the knee now. Because, and let's think about this, and you guys can probably do this on your own. In fact, when you guys get all this written down, I want you to do this. I want you to take your foot and move it into a pes planus position. And watch what happens to your tibia. You might put your hands on it because we're in pants. And watch what happens to your knee. Can anybody feel their tibia internally rotate when they kind of go over into that pes planus position? Like I said, you might put your hand on it. It's real subtle. It's only about 5 degrees. Right. So now, let's think about this. Okay, so if I have a more flexible foot, am I able to absorb force or disperse force better or produce force better? Disperse, exactly. So that first half of the gait cycle, like we talked about, where all my job is disperse force, because I got, all 250 of me or whatever crashing on the ground, which ain't fun. I need a flexible foot. So that first part of the gait cycle, not a problem. However, when I need to supinate during that second phase of the gait cycle, because remember, that first phase of the gait cycle, my foot is pronating, and then it transitions back and it supinates. That's when we're going to see a lot of these problems. Okay, so let's think about this. If I'm not able to produce nearly as much force as what I'm supposed to, what sorts of problems would you predict the patient would have? Say it loud.
Foot drag.
Foot drag, not so much. Because what is foot drag? I mean, that's dorsiflexion, or lack of dorsiflexion. Right. But good guess. What else? Say it louder. Plantar fasciitis. Ooh, interesting. What is plantar fasciitis? That sounds fun. Is itis of my plantar fascia, right? So what is the plantar fascia? It's this magical structure we have at the bottom of our feet, right? What is the plantar fascia? Connective tissue, right? Technically, if you read in Gray's, it's called the plantar aponeurosis. So if my plantar aponeurosis is not working properly, well, let's think about this. We just said that I have a more flexible foot. If I have a more flexible foot, what do we expect to happen to my arch? My arch is going to fall, but I'm also going to see the rear foot and the forefoot stretch, right? Well, that plantar aponeurosis, and we'll get into this a little later, is going to go from there to there. So that plantar aponeurosis is going to stretch too. Fair? Now, here's the problem. And I'm not picking on you, because I want to prove a point here, okay? But you made a very good answer. So that plantar fascia, that plantar aponeurosis is stretching. Where in the gait cycle would we expect to see that plantar fascia stretch the most? Not necessarily toe off. From heel strike to mid stance, right? Because what am I doing during heel strike to mid stance? I'm accepting weight. I'm crashing my 250 pounds down on my foot. When I do that, what's that going to do to my foot? It makes it expand, right? I need that to happen to disperse all of this against the ground. So that plantar fascia is going to stretch. Now, During the second phase of gait, I need my foot to do what? Produce force, right? So what sort of structures do I need to kick into gear to produce force? Probably my contractile tissues, right? My little tiny muscles. So here's my point. You need to ask that patient, when do you hurt, right? What time of day, what activities, whatever. Here's what they're going to tell you. It hurts when I walk. Because it does. It hurts when they walk. So the follow-up question is, where exactly in the cycle does it hurt? Because let's face it, let's think about this. If my pain is happening on the plantar surface of my foot during the second phase of gait, what is the plantar fascia doing during the second phase of gait? It's coming back together, right? It's going into a slack position. So would you expect a structure that's coming back to its natural resting position to hurt? Probably not. It's probably the intrinsic muscles in the plantar surface of the foot, not necessarily the plantar fascia. But here's your problem, and Ashley made a great point. What's the referral going to say? Plantar fasciitis. It is one of the most commonly overdiagnosed things that we're going to see in outpatient therapy. And that's exactly why, because the patient comes in, hurts the bottom of my foot, they're going to be able to push on it and go, ooh, yeah, ooh, hurts right there. When does it hurt? Oh, it hurts when I walk. That's probably plantar fasciitis. Go see a therapist. So they're going to come see you. You're going to get that diagnosis. It's going to be Friday at 4 o'clock. You're going to be worried because you got a weekend trip planned up. You're going to go, oh, okay, just plantar fasciitis. Sweet. Put some diathermy on it. They're going to knock on diathermy again. or Ionto, right? Clinical pro, don't put Ionto bottom of the foot. Why? Can anyone tell me why we should not put Ionto on the bottom of the foot?
There's a battery in it.
What's that?
There's a battery in it.
Well, there's a battery in it. That's one.
Painful.
But painful is another. How thick is the skin on everyone's bottom of the feet? It's real thick. It's real thick. So how much do you think that medication you think is actually getting through? Not much. Pedicure and like one of those places where the fish come and like chew off the dead skin and stuff, you know. And then a belt sander, right? And then diathermy, and then isophresis, right? Okay, so let's think about this. All right, so we have this flexible foot. What other sorts of implications can we see? That patient may not come to you with foot pain. They may come to you with knee pain. Uh-oh. So same patient, medial knee pain. What sorts of structures do we have on the medial knee that could be implicated with this sort of foot deformity? Number one, what are the structures on the medial knee? MCL is a big one. What's the other big one? Has the answer right? Okay, so if I have internal rotation happening, and you guys, and I saw some around the class did it, and I'll do it again. If I overpronate, and my tibia internally rotates, what's happening to the medial side of my knee? What's happening to the lateral side of my knee? Pressure on the lateral, gapping on the medial, right? So what sorts of structures are going to be more implicated or at more risk with gapping? Ligaments, right? Soft tissue, anything that can break when it's stretched. Okay, that's basically it. If it can break when it's stretched, it's at risk. When my bone is causing it to stretch. That even. Structures on the lateral side are going to be compressed. Or my ligamentous structures will be on slack. Right? So my LCL, my T-band, are going to be short. Are they not? They are. So I would not expect to see a high risk of my LCL tearing, but I could see my MCL tearing. So as you guys are approaching these problems, start thinking about it in that sort of context. I highly recommend, especially during this section, that you get up and you move to study. Okay, you get up and you actually do all these motions because it's going to make a lot more sense, especially on things like testing, which is happening here in, less than a month. All right, so let's go ahead. Let's take 5. Let's get up and a little DPT prevention.
If they already are in internal rotation, then blocking is more power.
I'm sorry?
If you have more congestion,
Good. What's the primary concentration? Because it's also less this way, this way, right?
there's nothing really within the
So in other words, because I can say this, bigger states are a lot different. So that's why we watch hockey run out. So basically, they get run, right? How do they run? Side to side, and hard to make action. Right? You watch these guys, they are always on plane. And that's why. Because they lack. Right? So they have to make it up from their point to your point, side to side. And then they go to the joints. Go back and these are really getting to the screen. Yeah, so when people say, oh, yeah, I see it, I know something. Exactly. Well, it's not soccer players. I would be more evaluating soccer players. Because you can take this foot and you can almost turn it and use it in inversion. Because it's all break down. That is a very common law. We're exclusively talking about tibial because it had regular articulates with the joints. Because I can use all that stuff in tibial off my fingers. So it's easy to do it non-weight there. Flex, internal rotation. It's easy to do it non-weight there. Because what's the population? What is called the Cuban region? Unlock. Unlock the door. What's the action? These structures, like if I'm standing here, right, so all this is short, and this is stretch. Right, so I have a rapid lengthening of my MCL, I've got the shortening of my LCL. You guys go over like contractions, right? Contractions is about
weakness, some directional hip rotation. Yeah, over
because you're long.
we see a lot of people that way more not and so when you're trying to get them to squats, their natural tendency is to collapse their knees into one another.
So that's why you put banner on the knees. That's why they do their clamshell very long. Right? Sometimes it's easy, but that's why for a lot of those patients that do clamshells, because a lot of folks don't realize, like I worked with a guy years ago, he used to call it DPS, right? Like literally, they did not know how to turn on anything back in the line. Yeah. So you gotta look at it through that whole chain. I don't particularly care for names like that because not everybody knows. Like I'll give you, right, exactly. Well, I'll give you a quick story. So I had this PTA work for me, his first year of practice. I put on the term soul. Right. So what did she do? Not what I meant. All right, let's go ahead and get rolling again here, guys. Okay, so a couple more slides on supination pronation. Okay. What we have to understand as well, like I said, the big difference between my upper extremity and my lower extremity is that my lower extremity can do this wonderful thing called weight bearing. Now, my upper extremity can do it too, and we're not going to leave it out. But at the same time, we know that weight bearing is much more of a factor and much more of a consideration when my lower extremity is on the ground. So supination, what we have to do is we have to understand, and these slides are all in the packet on Canvas, non-weight bearing versus weight bearing. Now what we're going to see with non-weight bearing supination is that everything kind of just comes from the calcaneus. That calcaneus is going to be our main bone that's moving. Now what we will see is that obviously other bones are going to react to that, but we're going to have much more of that reaction, much more of that whole chain deformity, whole chain motion when we're in a weight-bearing position. So what I want you to really consider is when we are in weight-bearing, remember that we have a couple different forces that are happening, right? When I'm weight-bearing, I have the force of gravity that's coming down. And then I have, in physics terms, the normal force, F of n, or like we like to call in therapy world, GRF, ground reaction force. Understand that if both of those forces, what is going down equals to what is going up, and those forces are going straight through the axis of rotation, then our system will be static, right? Makes sense. If all the forces are equal, then my system is static. My system is not moving. I have, in biology terms, homeostasis happening, right? We're cool. Once I introduce an external force, I create an imbalance. I create asymmetry. Then that's when this chain of events is going to start happening. So what we see, and we see this very, very often in the gait cycle, there is on my YouTube channel, like a 9-second video of somebody walking. Watch it, because I put it in like super slow motion with like super high res camera and all the whole shebang. Watch how their foot pronates and supinates through the gait cycle. And that should really clear a lot of this up. So what we see with pronation in a closed chain or during weight bearing, we're going to see this during the first half of the gait cycle. My calcaneus is going to evert. It kicks out to the side. Now, like we talked about, in the weight-bearing system, my talus is going to do the opposite of whatever my calcaneus does. Now, here's the problem. Like I said, the talus doesn't sit flush with the calcaneus. It sits off to that little bit of a side, that 42-degree on one plane, 8-degree in another plane angle, with the 3 different articulating facets. So my calcaneus everts. My talus is then going to plantar flex and adduct. And my tibia is going to internally rotate. That's going to happen during the first half of that gait cycle, because during that first half of the gait cycle, remember, my job is to disperse as much force as possible. Therefore, I need to create as flexible of a system as possible. Okay, this is the difference between landing on a big air mattress and landing on the ground. During the second half of gait, I'm going to have the supination chain of events that happens. Now, as I'm going through mid-stance, and now I need to produce force, now I need my calcaneus to invert, right? I need calcaneal inversion. The talus is going to do what the talus does, which is simply go along for the ride and react. My talus is going to dorsiflex and abduct, and my tibia externally rotates. And if we think about that, that's really mechanically advantageous for me, because when I am producing force during the gait cycle, I want as rigid of a system as possible so that I can get the most bang for my buck during push-off, right? So we already kind of talked about with tibial external rotation, we've already associated that with the screw home mechanism at the knee. So my tibia has to externally rotate to create full extension at my knee, right? What's the advantage of creating full extension at the knee during the push-off phase of gait? It creates a rigid knee, right? So if I stood here and somebody tried to push down on me with my knees extended, is that going to be easier or harder than if my knees flexed a little bit and somebody pushed down on me? It's going to be easier when I'm standing up straight. I'm sorry, it's going to be harder standing up straight, easier to push me down with my knees flexed. Right? Why is that? Because when I am standing up straight, I'm able to take that gravitational force and put it straight through the bone, right? And this is my tibia and this is my femur. That force can go straight through the bone. Therefore, I can use that during the push-off phase of gait and I can push off of a rigid lower extremity. Therefore, translating the most amount of muscle contraction against the floor, because I know the floor is going to be there to push back against me. And that's how I can propel myself during gait, is that ground reaction force pushes me. I push against the ground, it pushes back against me. Do you want an example of that? Try walking around the building for a day with your knees bent for the entire day. Good luck, you're going to get sore. Okay, but I have to understand how that system works. And I want to spend a lot of time on supination and pronation because it's going to have ramifications all the way up the chain. Okay, any questions on supination? All right, so pronation. Again, pronation, typically going to happen during the first half of gait. What am I going to see in the non-weight bearing position? Calcaneal eversion, calcaneal abduction, calcaneal dorsiflexion. During weight bearing, that's when things get kind of funky, because now I have those forces again, both coming down from gravity, going back up from ground reaction force or normal force, and that's going to create this kind of reaction-action system. So during weight-bearing pronation, again, first half of the gait cycle, trying to accept force. Calcaneal eversion, talar adduction, and plantar flexion. Again, talus doesn't sit flush on the calcaneus, so there's going to be a couple different motions that happen. And then my tibia is going to internally rotate. This is going to create a more flexible system. All right, any questions on pronation? All right, so when we talk about joints of the midfoot, and we'll dive into a little bit of this today, and then we're going to dive into a ton of ligaments on Monday. I'm going to have several different ligaments at play here. I'm going to have 7 different ligaments that can really help these arches. Now, like I talked about earlier, we got 3 different arches. Okay, we're going to have the medial longitudinal arch. We're also going to have a lateral longitudinal arch. And then we're going to have another arch called the transverse metatarsal arch. Now, the nice thing about these arches is that they all say what they are and they all are what they say. Right? The medial longitudinal arch is going to be that arch that we most commonly associate with the arch. Right? So if someone has fallen arches, typically what we are referring to is a collapsed medial longitudinal arch. Please understand that we actually have 3 arches in our foot. There are some textbooks out there, some kinesics textbooks that will have a 4th arch. So some will add in a transverse tarsal arch in addition to the transverse metatarsal arch. I'm going by Gray's because I want to keep everything standard. Gray's only identifies 3 arches. But you may see that in the literature. You may see that next year in MSK where there's a 4th arch. Understand the 4th arch is going to be that transverse tarsal arch. So in other words, don't go next year in MSK and go, well, wait a minute, there's no 4th arch. According to some textbooks, there are. And if you do, trust me, I'll call you out on it. So what I have to understand is that each of these arches are going to be supported by ligament. So the first one we're going to cover here is going to be this medial longitudinal arch. Now this medial longitudinal arch is going to be covered and going to be supported by something that's called the spring ligament. And the reason that I'm putting the word spring in quotations is because up to this point, I've always talked about says what it does what it says, is what it says, and all that stuff, right? But what I don't want you to think is I don't want you to think when June hits and it turns into summer that we lose this ligament, right? Come on, guys. Right? And this ligament does act like a spring, but this ligament is also called the plantar calcaneal navicular ligament. Guaranteed, Grandma will never want to play Scrabble with you ever again. Okay? But that's what that medial longitudinal arch supporting structure is going to be, is that spring ligament. Now, this is where I can go back to my comfort zone of says what it is and is what it says. Because my plantar calcaneal navicular ligament is going to be my ligament that's located in the plantar aspect of the foot. And it's going to attach my calcaneus to my navicular. That was interesting. Okay, I didn't know if I know if you hold a seashell next to your ear, you can hear the ocean. I know she was holding her laptop next to her, can you hear Bill Gates? So my plantar calcaneal navicular ligament is going to attach two different sections together. And I'm going to draw this out, very rudimentary, elementary drawing like I always do. This is going to be a lateral view of my calcaneus. We're going to call this lateral calcaneus. This structure here is something else, going to win you lots of points in Scrabble. Sustain taculum tali. Now the sustentaculum tali is this tiny little super duper, looks like it's insignificant, probably going to end up on the lab final structure on the medial aspect of the calcaneus. And the purpose of the sustentaculum tali is to provide an anchor point for the spring ligament. Now, like I said, the plantar calcaneal navicular ligament or spring ligament attaches my navicular to my calcaneus. So there's my navicular. And this is why I want to make this point. If you look at the textbook, you're going to see a little line that goes from one structure to the other. Okay, and this is going to be my spring ligament. From the lateral aspect, from the lateral view, that structure looks like it's very thin. It's not that big of a deal. Understand that the spring ligament is a very broad, very flat, very wide structure. And we can see that up here at the very top in this picture up here. That spring ligament is going to be obliquely oriented, but mostly oriented in the transverse plane. And you guys can probably get a good appreciation based on the fiber orientation and the morphology of that ligament and its position on the medial aspect, that what it will do is it will support my medial longitudinal arch. Okay, so that's one of those plantar ligaments that has a super duper long name But if you break it down, just kind of figure out what it does, it becomes quite easy. So I'll tell you what, let's go ahead and let's cut it there for today. And we'll pick this back up on Monday with all the other ligaments. Sure. Talking about this one?
Yeah.
Okay.
For the supination, is the talus doing the function or Plantar Fascia?
And the supination? Talking about this one here?
Yeah.
So that's weight bearing. So it's going to be doing dorsiflexion and abduction.
In weight bearing,
And weight bearing.
the non.
Non-weight bearing is mostly based off the calcaneus. Does that make sense? Kind of, sort of, not really? Yeah. So if you look at the spring ligament, it mostly sits, like I said, it comes off that subtalar tali and attaches to the medial plantar aspect of the navicular. Okay, so if you look at it from the underside or the plantar side, basically what you have is, here's my calcaneus, here's my navicular, and I have this ligament that kind of does that number. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. So, and then it is the medial line.
Yeah. Yeah.
I found this really good picture.
Oh, yeah?
Shows actually a kind of a superior, middle, and inferior.
Okay.
I like that because people, I think, are going to, like you said, think that, okay, we're talking